Okay, so you should have opened up the PDF that has the morphology and anatomy cards. If you haven't done that, then go ahead and open up those PDFs so that you can now look at these cards as we're kind of going through this. And you can pause this at any time and kind of look with more detail. But kind of go through those cards and see what things are similar and what things are different. And if there's any words that you don't understand, then go ahead and also look those words up and maybe try to figure those out. I'll maybe give you some hints on some of them. Like, for example, a lot of these have chlorophyll. Well, chlorophyll is a molecule that is used in photosynthesis. And then what we're going to do is talk about these 6 different groups without assigning a name on it for right now. Okay, we're going to come to that. In fact, some of you might already have an idea of what some of these groups are as we go through this. So let's look at these. All the groups, for example, have the pigment chlorophyll A. So they all photosynthesize, at least using that pigment in the same way. All groups except C have a membrane-bound nucleus. All groups except C have the pigment chlorophyll B. All groups except C have a cell wall made of cellulose. All groups except C and D are primarily multicellular. So there you can already see some of the similarities that are happening among different groups. Some of the differences that you also may have observed could include that only group C has cell walls made of peptidoglycan and contains the pigment phycocyanin. Groups A, B, E, and F have a cuticle and stomata, while the rest do not. Only groups A, E, and F have lignin and vascular tissue. Only groups A and F have secondary growth, and only group A has vessels for water transport. So now that you've been able to look over those, again, you can pause this video at any time and kind of re-look at these. Let's think about, for each of these groups, where might they live and how might they reproduce. So for group A, you may decide that its preferred environment may be on land and not aquatic. This conclusion could be drawn because these organisms have lignin, vascular tissue, and secondary growth, which all provide structural support that enables them to grow upright against gravity. We may also speculate that this group lives in more exposed conditions, where its members could benefit from a range of wavelengths of solar radiation. This conclusion is supported by it because they have both chlorophyll A and B. Further, we may guess that members of this group can live in dry environments, at least that are not constantly wet. There needs to be always at least some water. Evidence that supports this conclusion is that these plants have a cuticle, stomata, and vascular tissue. Specifically, they have tracheids and vessels, which are far more efficient at conducting water. This morphology would allow these plants then to regulate their water loss and extract water from the ground where it might be more plentiful. Finally, we may guess that members of this group are likely capable of sexual reproduction, which would require the process of meiosis, making eggs and sperm, because this plant is multicellular. If we move over to group B, maybe we could guess that this group lives on land because many within this group also have a cuticle and stomata. We know that it must defend against water loss, however, because it doesn't have the conducting tissue, lignin, or secondary growth. And this group is probably then much smaller, much lower to the ground. Maybe like Group A, Group B also has chlorophyll A and B, which indicates that it can live on land and can use a broad range of different wavelengths of light. And because it has multicellular, the Group B is also multicellular and has the presence of a nucleus, perhaps we might conjecture this group is also is also possible a sexually reproducing type of organism. If we move on to Group C, we see that it's one of the most unique of the 6 groups. It has no membrane-bound nucleus, therefore we can conclude that it is not a eukaryote, rather it is a prokaryote, and it's a unicellular microorganism, so it's really, really, really small. Because it lacks some of the morphological characteristics seen above for the plants that live on land, we can probably conclude that this organism must live in water. We can further find support for this assumption because it doesn't have chlorophyll B. It only has the phycocyanin. It is given this name because it appears kind of as a bluer pigment, and because this pigment reflects blue light. The cyanin there is the root for blue. However, this pigment is good at capturing light or absorbing in the yellow range, in the medium wavelengths of light. So it still can do photosynthesis, just in a slightly different way than other more green types of plants might do it. Further, members of group C are dependent upon obtaining their nutrient, not nitrogen, from the environment. You can see this by looking at the consumption of its cell walls, peptidoglycan, which contains nitrogen, when all the other groups do not have this need, as cellulose has no nitrogen in it. So there, if you weren't able to stumble across that as you were looking these things up, there's a big difference there between cellulose and peptidoglycan. Further, the pigment phycocyanin can also serve as a nitrogen storage molecule, which can help balance this nitrogen dependence. Finally, members of group C likely must rely on asexual means of reproduction because it is unicellular, so they don't make eggs and sperm, they don't undergo meiosis. Group D is also lacking many of the traits that enable it to live on land. It doesn't have stomata or vascular tissues or cuticle, so you can conclude probably it lives in an aquatic habitat. However, it does share the chlorophyll A and B pigments with groups A and B. This may suggest that although members of group D are aquatic, they probably live in very shallow water, or they live on the surface of the water, and in very moist, they could even live in very moist environments on the land. Reproduction in this group is most likely not sexual reproduction because they're primarily unicellular. Group E shares many similarities with Group A. Therefore, we would assume that many of the same conclusions about that group as this group. The main key difference is in the anatomy between Group A is that this group lacks the vessels for conduction of water and other things, mostly water. These vessels are superior to tracheids in water conduction because they represent cells that have coalesced to form this tube-like structure of indeterminate length, which allows for greater efficiency in water movement. Therefore, we may assume that if members of this group do live in very dry conditions, that most members are not quite as tall. And because there's a nucleus, and this is multicellular group, probably sexual reproduction is happening. Finally, for Group F, this group shares many similarities with Group E. So again, we can guess that it's probably land-dwelling. It can live in some dry environments. However, this group lacks secondary growth, so it doesn't have woody parts. So it probably doesn't get very tall. It's probably a closer to the ground growing type of an organism. And again, this group is probably capable of reproducing sexually because it is multicellular and has a nucleus.